In the last 20 years or so, a seismic shift has occurred in the watch industry. A groundswell of small independent watchmakers have established a name for themselves, introducing unique, innovative timepieces with ever more complicated, intricate, and sophisticated movements. What is behind the renaissance of small production watchmaking? What has caused interest in the boutique horology mentality to gain so much universal traction in recent years? In today's deep dive, we're taking a look at the world of independent watchmaking and exploring the factors that have led to the return of the small watchmaking shop. To properly understand the internal forces within the watch industry, it's helpful to zoom back out and analyze the evolution of production styles for watch brands throughout history. The earliest references to mechanical clocks appear in Dante's Divine Comedy, written in the early 14th century. Around this time and into the 15th century, clock towers and larger timekeepers became commonplace across Europe, and watchmaking as a trade proliferated across much of the developed world. For the first several hundred years of watchmaking, watchmakers were still individual artisans, sometimes with a handful of assistants or apprentices at most. This was so true that by the early 1700s, there were so many watchmakers concentrated in Geneva that new artisans began to venture to the Journe mountains to escape the dense concentration of competition. In the latter portion of the 18th century, dynamics began to change as standardized production systems allowed true brands for the first time to emerge. Instead of being centered around a common watchmaker, by this point, individual watchmakers began to center around central brand identities. With this came names like Vacheron Constantin in 1755 and Breguet in 1775. Throughout the 19th century, the availability and ease with which mechanized manufacturing grew made the small shop model of watchmaking begin to shrink away. It was simply extremely difficult for any independent maker to distinguish themselves when brands like Patek and others were able to make ever more accurate pieces at scale. Thus, the small production clock and watch shops that once characterized Geneva began to consolidate and all but dissipate. While it is easy to view this as a negative phenomenon, some of the household names of today were built as a result of the shrinking of the independent watchmaking trade. With pipelines of young watchmakers headed to Audemars Piguet, JLC, Rolex, and others, larger brands were able to invest in technological enhancements and help push watchmaking forward. At the individual level, many watches were still hand-finished and treated with the care and attention of a specific dedicated artisan. Brands were operated much more like independents than they are today. Many consider the 1800s through the early 1900s to be the golden age of watchmaking. There was also tremendous incentive for watchmakers to align themselves with larger brands that would provide legitimacy and stability for aspiring watchmakers. To break away and start your own manufacture, you would need considerable resources, tooling, manpower, and skill. Young apprentices almost never had this option at their disposal. And so, while some small shops remained, they became the exception rather than the norm, as was once the case. And then, in the 1970s, the Quartz Crisis threatened the traditional watchmaking industry. For the first time, no one needed a mechanical watch. Mechanical watches became a conscious choice rather than a mandated reality. A number of changes were made in the old guard of traditional watchmaking. For one, even though it wasn't a consciously communicated shift, most Swiss brands that survived shifted further into the luxury category. Rolex, once predominantly a tool watch brand, became the image of luxury. This is something that's taken for granted in the modern day, but if you actually think about it, Rolex's innovations were in the world of spec. Waterproofing, shock resistance, automatic winding, etc. were all about pushing the limits of the wristwatch as a tool, not as a luxury product. And yet, in a post-Quartz Crisis market, Rolex and any other strong premium watch brand had to resolutely stand out as a different product. If Rolex, Patek, and others could brand quartz watches as a mass market product and position themselves as luxury, quality, handmade items, they could successfully make the case for their value add in the new market. As you might not be surprised to see, in the 80s, coinciding with roughly the same time frame, exhibition casebacks became commonplace. Patek and Vacheron could do things with movement finish that you simply don't find on a quartz piece. It was a carefully considered marketing move by luxury brands. In a sense, the messaging was, we aren't a mass market manufacturer. Look at the exceptional workmanship of our skilled artisans, which was displayed through these exhibition casebacks. The strategy worked brilliantly. The luxury segment of the watch industry went on to prosper. Patek released some of its most successful watches ever in the 80s, right after the Quartz watch's introduction. Rolex exploded in popularity, reaching unrivaled heights. Dozens of other brands rose to the challenge of Quartz and had their glory years in this period. A subconscious outgrowth of the return to fixation on watchmaking in its purest form was that collectors now demanded ever higher standards from watchmakers. Standards of finishing, handwork, movement, ingenuity, etc. that collectors came to expect was unlike ever before, and as a result, the opportunity for those previously rare, bespoke watchmakers to distinguish themselves once again returned. The manufacturing market was ripe for a renaissance in independent watchmaking. In 1985, prominent independent watchmakers formed the AHCI, a group designed to unify the independent watchmaking force of previously separate watchmakers and provide a platform for the promotion and cultivation of independent watches. Simultaneously, for the first time, aspiring watchmakers had many role models to look to for inspiration. George Daniels, one of the most influential watchmakers in history, published his monumental book, The Art of Breguet, in 1974. Daniels became a cultural sensation in the watch world. He brilliantly took classic works of Breguet and others and modernized them for contemporary customers. Not only were his contributions significant to the watch industry, they inspired countless other watchmakers to break the centuries-old norm of working for a watch house and to take the plunge to set out on one's own. Internally, the watch industry was ready for an explosion in independent watchmaking. As I said earlier, the dynamics that pushed the independent watchmaking industry to the forefront were both within the industry and from the consumer base. Customers were certainly expecting and demanding more from watch brands as a result of the ever-growing emphasis on movement finishing and ingenuity. But at the same time, the modern market in almost all industries is characterized by mass production and mechanized manufacturing. Across industries, the case for artisan crafts and quality, dedicated handwork, has been made ever more clear. When something is readily available, ubiquitous, and perfectly executed, it becomes undesirable to many customers. Put differently, independent watchmaking and fine crafts of any kind are about the pursuit of perfection through a means and process that will definitely yield an imperfect result. Handwork introduces micro-imperfections that are the result of the exchange between a craftsperson and their work. That imperfection, albeit minute, is evidence of the craftsperson-to-craft relationship, a genuine rarity in the modern era. Artisan work humanizes manufacturing into a very personal thing in a unique way. Will a handmade watch be as objectively perfect as a machine-made one? In all likelihood, not. But it's precisely this that makes the handmade watch so valuable and desirable. For years, watchmaking was all about improving standards of accuracy, making the most precise components repeatedly to deliver reliability, consistency, and dependability for watches. On the small production side, the pendulum has swung back. Perfection is a sign of a failure to give the craftsperson agency over their work, to pursue their craft in the purest sense. This mentality has given birth to an entirely new degree of appreciation for fine, independent watches. If you wanted the most accurate watch, you'd use your phone or your Quartz watch. That's no longer what the conversation is about. Now it's about design, handwork, and dedication to tradition. What market segment perfectly satisfies this need? Independent watchmaking. The confluence of internal and external draws of demand for independent watches was met by an equally eager set of dedicated craftspeople that were more than happy to dedicate themselves to filling this demand. We already touched on George Daniels. He was responsible not only for some of the most beautiful small production pieces, he also democratized watchmaking, focusing on education and training, and codifying many of the practices of classical masters of watchmaking for the global community. He was also a massive innovator, developing the coaxial escapement in 1976 and patenting it by 1980. Perhaps Daniels' most clear successor to the independent watchmaking tradition was Roger Smith, who moved to the Isle of Man to work alongside Daniels and learn from his expertise. Smith then became a sensation of similar magnitude. At a similar time, Philippe Dufour graduated from watchmaking school and went to work first for JLC. Dufour quickly bounced around a number of high-end manufacturers before starting his own collection at Basel Watch Fair in 1992. Dufour fixated on fine finishing and created some of the most important watches of the era. Dufour became fabulously famous for his beautiful pieces, simple in aesthetic, but extremely complicated in execution. Perhaps the perfect culmination of these masters was the pivotal work of F.P. Journe. F.P. Journe completely changed the face and trajectory of the independent watchmaking industry. Journe was born in Marseille, France in 1957 and left school early to study with his uncle, who had a clock shop that worked on many famous works from the likes of Breguet, Ante de Janvier, and even George Daniels. Journe quickly became fascinated with Daniels' work, read his books, and began to work on a tourbillon of his own. Not only did Journe complete a tourbillon, he incorporated a detent escapement and double barrels. In essence, his very first watch was far more complicated than what many watchmakers ever made in their entire career. In many respects, Journe's first watch was a metaphorical representation of all that was to come in the years that followed. In 1999, Journe presented his tourbillon wristwatch, and then just a year later, the Resonance, an exceptional watch that had 2 escapements and gear trains incorporated into just one case. Journe's creations were a unique blend of traditional approaches and stylistic choices with a decidedly unique contemporary flavor. Journe watches are both traditional and fresh simultaneously, and it's this tightrope that Journe walks so masterfully, and that's why he's so famous today. Since 1999, Journe has come up with a staggering number of designs and movements as one of the most prolific watchmakers in the entire industry. He also has paved the way, perhaps more than any other watchmaker, for others to follow him in creating their own eponymous brands. Journe is simultaneously a brand and an independent. Very few independents have managed to establish a brand level of recognition the way Journe has. The manufacturer makes fewer than 1,000 watches a year, but now has millions of passionate followers, all vying for just a couple pieces. This degree of success is an inspiration that has motivated many other watchmakers to set out on their own. And that has made Journe, in essence, a godfather of the independent watchmaking industry. In roughly the same time frame as the rise of Journe, we've also seen the expansion of a number of other wonderful makers with their own idiosyncrasies and defining attributes. Kari Voutilainen is known for his striking guilloche dials and polished balance staffs. Debetune established a name for itself by creating futuristic designs, much like your work, whose overbuilt creations resemble the watch that you would expect to be worn in Jurassic Park. In a similar light, MB&F, led by Max Busser, created some of the most otherworldly designs the watchmaking industry has ever seen. The important point to emphasize is that there's a degree of particularity and specificity that an independent brand can pursue that would never be found in a mass market context. And there's a really good reason for this. When a brand makes 50,000 watches a year, they need to appeal to a market of 50,000 customers. Conversely, a brand that makes only 800 pieces needs only 800 customers. This means that a brand like Laurent Ferrier is far less beholden to the customer than, say, Patek. And that's not a particularly bad thing. It means that Laurent Ferrier can make whatever they want, and the customer that is inclined toward that unique design will be attracted to the product, because Laurent Ferrier knows that no matter what they make, there will be enough customers to justify the making. As a result, there's a much closer alignment between consumer desire and the producer's supply in the independent watchmaking market. Independents can cater to a much more niche taste in a way that a mass market product would never even think of considering. Independent watchmaking has become one of the most beloved corners of the industry, with some of the most impressive innovation coming not from the big houses, but instead from smaller artisans. We can only expect to watch the independent watchmaking segment to grow and continue to gain momentum in years to come. To learn more about independent watches and discover our full selection, be sure to head to analogshift.com. And if you found this video helpful or informative, be sure to like the video and subscribe to our channel. We'll see you next time.